Greetings EPQers, this is a quick EPQ video on the discussion segment of the EPQ, which some of you have started, some of you will start in the not too distant future, and others of you are a little way away from it, but don't panic. So on we go. So let's just have a brief overview of the discussion in the EPQ, and remember it's all in your handbook, more or less, page 20, camera, yeah, page 21 in the yellow book. So a lot of what I say here isn't there. There's a few sort of bits of my own wisdom and examples and things, but you know, as always, consult the handbook for EPQ if there are any problems. So let's just have an overview of the discussion to see where we're going. So first of all, word count, what students are obsessed with. So the guidance is 2,500 to 3,000 words as a minimum. And so much of that depends on how well you're writing, your style of writing, and what you're writing about. One thing to be clear on, as we'll discuss in a bit, is the word count and the word limit. Basically, there isn't one. We'll come on to that in a bit. What else are we going to talk about when we're looking at the discussion? Well, the use of headings and subheadings, because that can make the difference between you know, 10 pages of indigestible text and something that's nice and clearly laid out. And what you're trying to do with these things, as always, is help the marker give you the marks. We're also going to look at arguments and counter-arguments. Counter-arguments absolutely crucial to the discussion, as are arguments, unsurprisingly. We're going to think about how to link to the research review, because that is crucial. Remember, the research review is supposed to be the you know, intellectual, factual depth that you need to understand the discussion. We're also going to briefly look at linking between sections, which is a crucial part of the mark scheme. So on to the word count. So as I was saying before, you've got a 2,500 to 3,000 word guide. You know, it is possible to get an A star with 3,000 words in your discussion, probably even 2,500 words. What I saw last year was that a lot of discussions were about 4,000. There was a fair number that were about 5,000. And that's fine. There is no word limit for the EPQ. What the word sort of limits or guidance figures that we give you are a bit of a, you know, this is a minimum to actually be able to write something that will score highly. I think that's maybe the best way of looking at them. So if you stick precisely to all the you know, word limits for introductions and discussions and research reviews, and you do it very, very well, there's no reason why you can't get an A star, and someone else who does double the word count will get a B. If you start going below the recommended word counts, you're almost certainly not putting in enough detail. So look at them in that way. If you've done 3,000 words and you think I need another 1,500 words to make my argument, to tick various other boxes in terms of argument and counter argument and breadth and detail, then take those 1,500 words. Just don't pad, don't put in irrelevant stuff, don't put in weak stuff, especially if you've already done 4,000 words. Don't sit there and add another 3,000 words of slightly, you know, waffly, poorly thought out nonsense, because that won't get you any marks, and it will irritate the examiner, who is me. Although it's obviously some EPQs are then sent off to be sort of double checked, so don't worry, you're not entirely at the whim, at my mercy as to whether I've got a hangover or my favourite rugby team have lost or anything like that. There is some objectivity in the process. So let's look now at headings and structure. So just a few things to kind of point out for the discussion. So first of all, it's not a timed essay, and you all come from quite different sort of academic backgrounds with regard to A levels, if you like. You know, sometimes if you're doing history or classics or English, you're used to writing these, you know, quite long essays that don't have headings or subheadings or diagrams. You know, it's all about this intense sort of focus on prose, which is good, which is important for a history or a classics exam. But in the EPQ, it's not a timed essay under exam conditions, and you really need to think, what can I do to this EPQ that will add to the clarity of argument? And that really is headings and subheadings. That can really highlight where you're meeting the requirements of the mark scheme. The other thing to think about is to use relevant and legally obtained maps, diagrams, and images. But be careful, don't throw in random maps that don't make a difference, or images of celebrities. If you're doing an EPQ on World War II, would you need to show a picture of Hitler so people know what Hitler looks like, or because it's a dramatic picture? I mean, you could, you certainly wouldn't get marked down, but you're probably not going to get, you're probably not going to get anything for it. Whereas if you're talking about the, the significance of the English Channel in stopping the Germans from invading England during World War II, then maybe an image to show the nature of the channel that you then discuss would be relevant. So relevant images, maps, and diagrams can be brilliant. Irrelevant ones are just filler, and again could distract from the argument. Okay, so what about the overall structure of your discussion? As a good general rule, and we've talked about this before, and I gave you those A3 sheets many moons ago to try and get you thinking along these lines, but just a quick reminder, you want 4 or 5 big headings, and those are broad concepts in which there is an argument. So the 4 or 5 chunks of your argument, and those would be quite big chunks, or they could be quite big chunks, depending on the nature of your EPQ. And once you've split it down into those 4 or 5 big chunks, use as many relevant subheadings as needed. And with these subheadings, use it to create clarity. And obviously, clarity would often be when you're changing direction or changing significance. Put in a little subheading to show that you've done that. Okay, so let's again have a look at some sample structures and ideas. And this is just a very brief overview, and it doesn't always work with everyone's EPQ, but hopefully it will make sense. So imagine you're doing an EPQ on why did the Allies win World War II? So the Allies being, Britain, America, France, Canada, etc. Fighting the Germans and Japanese and a few others in World War II. So you look at it, you do your research, and you think of some big headings, and these big headings are where you've seen most historians make arguments, and the arguments would be things like the military superiority of the Allies won them the war, the economic superiority of the Allies in terms of structure or sheer output allowed them to win the war, the political systems of the Allies allowed them to win the war, and the geographic location of the Allies allowed them to win the war. So those are your 4 big areas that you would split your discussion up into, but within them there could be quite a significant degree of variation. So let's look at what might happen. So you pick one of these areas of discussion, which is the military. So I would start this section with a crystal clear argument, and this is one thing that you've really got to make sure you're doing, and that is arguing and showing a knowledge of others' arguments in your EPQ. One quite good way of starting a section is by relating it to other factors, and this is because links between sections is also an important aspect of the mark scheme. So as an example start to this military section in our EPQ could be something along these lines. So many scholars, such as Smith, have argued that the Allies won World War II due to their military superiority, and that political differences were largely irrelevant. So what we've done here is we've shown a very clear argument. We've acknowledged a counter argument, i.e. politics, that we might have explored previously, or that we'll explore later, and that also serves the function of linking the two sections together, which, as I said before, is a crucial part of the mark scheme. However, the nature of this superiority is hotly debated, with some scholars favouring the argument that numbers were crucial, whilst others argue it was superior technology. So what we're doing in this opening statement is saying, military superiority is one of our crucial arguments, but what that means can be broken down into further debates, and those further debates are going to be your subheadings. Now, just a point to note here, and that's to think back to our research review. So if we're doing a research review for why did the Allies win the Second World War, and we were making the arguments we were making, what sort of things would we expect to see in our research review? Well, you'd expect to see battles and their significance, and that's where you can have a bit of debate in the research review. So it would be, what were the big battles, who won them, and how significant were those battles? Because that way you're not necessarily arguing why, so that doesn't sort of interfere with the discussion element of your EPQ. Why did the Allies win? You'd also be looking at things like types of technology. So you might explore different types of tank, different types of aeroplane, and again debate their significance or their ability. You might have done a discussion on the different numbers in each of the various countries' armies, and then had a debate on whether those numbers were accurate, or what those numbers actually meant. So the research review should be providing the kind of big factual building blocks with a little bit of debate and discussion that support the more theoretical arguments of the discussion that answer your question. So, why did the Allies win World War II? We've identified our big, broad theme of the military, and then we've broken it down into 3 subheadings. And we've chosen the following subheadings because they are they're good subheadings. So we've got the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. And why are these good subheadings in our EPQ? Well, they're very natural ways to break it down, because these things all have a different impact. They use different technology, and they deal with different theories of victory. So splitting them into these 3 areas is quite sensible. So we'd say that the Army, that's one area, and they killed most of the enemy. So you could argue they are the most important part of this military victory. The Air Force destroyed more enemy industry, which led to victory. So we're both, and the Navy protected trade routes, which allowed economic superiority to lead to victory. So all of these are arguing that military was the most important part of victory, but they're looking at just slightly different angles, and they're also quite nicely, some of them anyway, starting to integrate with other arguments. So, for example, the Air Force destroying enemy industry and the Navy protecting your trade routes will feed into economic arguments as well. So another thing that you absolutely have to do is to have counter arguments. What makes a counter argument? That's certainly something that's worth thinking about. In a sense, some are, and most are pretty obvious, but maybe it's worth thinking about some of these types of counter argument. So you can look for theories that disagree in terms of a slightly smaller focus. So you could have 2 historians who say Allied military superiority led to victory in World War II. One historian says it's because of the Navy, another one says it's because of the Air Force, and you can play those off against each other. So even though they're both arguing for military superiority as the reason for winning, there's debate within them. Other counter-arguments would be on a broader scale, so counter-arguments that disagree with the entire principle. And this is a bit more natural in your EPQ because those would be your other sections. So some historians argue it was an economic victory, others argue it was a military victory. Now, the third way that you can introduce counter-arguments is your own ideas on all of these different theories. And indeed, this is something that you need to do to actually be writing an analytical and argumentative EPQ. And we'll just explore that a little bit more later on. But if someone comes up with a theory, you can challenge it with your own ideas as long as they're supported by evidence. So just bear that in mind. Where do you put these counter arguments? Now, this is something that you really have to think about. Where do they fit naturally? Where do they fit best? What makes sense within the structure that you have chosen? So if you look again at your the military part of this EPQ, and we're looking at our subheading of the army, what you could do is you could talk about how the army was the most important because they killed the most number of people, blah, 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 blah. And then just at the end of that paragraph, you can start to compare it to the importance of the Air Force, because that then leads into your next little subheading of the Air Force. Now, in your Air Force paragraph, you might actually be looking at a different type of counter-argument where, although the main part of the paragraph is talking about the importance of the Air Force in destroying enemy industry, but then your counter-argument there might be, well, actually calculating the impact of the Air Force on enemy industry is really quite controversial, and we can't make a strong judgment on it. Then when you're looking at, so then you might move on to the, talking about the Navy, and there you might introduce a counter-argument that links to a different theme entirely. So economics, remember I've written politics there, but economics is probably a better example, where you're looking at that kind of integration of trade routes, the Navy protecting the trade routes, and so on and so forth. So within these little subheadings, you might have different types of counter-arguments. Now, the other thing that you can do is you could have a counter-argument section. I don't have a slide for it, but you could have your military big heading, your three little subheadings, and then a kind of fourth heading of counter argument. There's no reason why you couldn't do that. As a historian, I generally think argument followed immediately by counter argument works so much better, because you put the argument, the counter argument, and then you make a judgment. And you making a judgment is absolutely crucial, because one of the mistakes that people do make in EPQ is they don't make a personal judgment. They say, well, Smith argues this, Jones argues that, Smith argues this, Jones argues that. And what you're doing there, you're not analysing, you're not arguing, you're simply writing down other people's arguments, which is not the discussion. That's not how the discussion works. You write down Smith's argument, you talk about why it's valid using your knowledge, your opinion, your research. You then compare it to Jones's argument, and again critique and analyse Jones's argument using your own knowledge, research, and then you look at how the two work together. So let's just have a look at this list of things to remember. So the discussion must be argumentative. I just cannot stress that enough. It should be an almost constant argumentative flow, because remember the fact that too many factual descriptions are done in the research review. As I was saying before, you've got to analyse the arguments of other scholars, not simply list them. We've also talked about before, sections have got to be linked together. Sometimes that can just be quite a simple, slightly clumsy linking sentence, but remember, it has to be done. And by sections, I usually mean the sort of bigger, broader arguments, so military, economic, political. If you're linking your subsections together, again, I think that works quite well, but it's more those big chunks of argument that really need to be clearly linked. The other thing to really think about now is the relevance and the connection to the research review. what you may well find is you've done your research review, you do your discussion plan or discussion outline, or write a first draft of the discussion, and then as you read through it, and one thing I would do that can be really helpful if you can find someone is get someone who doesn't know anything about the subject to read through it, and see whether the research review does give them the relevant information to understand what's going on in the discussion section. So yeah, do this and make sure the research review is relevant to the discussion section. Have you gone off on a massive tangent? Have you gone into too much depth about something, and that doesn't really feature as a significant piece of knowledge for understanding the main discussion? So that was just a very quick run through on the discussion and the nature of discussions. Hopefully it was useful. Obviously, if you've got any questions, queries or issues, message me on Teams. Remember, you've got 4+ exemplar EPQs that cover, you know, a bit of science, a bit of history, a bit of other stuff. So I would always look at them, because you look at them and they show you the marks, and that should give you an idea of a lot of these things. But anyway, as I've said, if there's any issues, message me. Otherwise, good luck, and I will catch up with you later on.